All right, guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to talk about the Collath ecosystem of shotgun shells. Now, what are you talking about here, Murph? Guys, for the last couple of months, I've been doing off and on a series covering obscure, obsolete, and niche shotgun shell cartridges. If you're interested in that, go ahead and check out the links in the description to the previous videos. This is building on that idea, but it's not as general. So I'm not necessarily rolling it into that series as much as referencing that series. There is a lot of very interesting terminology that goes along with like shotgun shells and stuff like that. And I did a whole video covering that. So if you're interested in like the terms associated with shotgun shells, go ahead and check out the link in the description of that video. This system, the Collath family of not just shotgun shells, but also ammunition in general, as well as firearms, subverts all of that. It is a completely separate ecosystem. It's no different than if you had like a species of fish get trapped, like part of a species of fish get trapped in like a cave, and then they developed a whole bunch of like underground type capabilities, organs, all those types of things that would become a completely separate species of fish at that point. That's kind of where we're at with this. So with that being the case, we're going to hop into the history of the man for which these, well, some of the history for the man for which this ammunition is named for, the company that it was involved with, the firearms that they designed, and then culminate talking more about the ammunition and the shotgun shells specifically and what makes them so interesting. All right, so our story begins with a gentleman named Wilhelm Collath. Now, I'm not entirely sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly. The Collath, I have no idea what the actual proper pronunciation is. So we're just kind of winging it here. I'm sure someone will correct me in the comments, and that's okay. He was born in 1838, which would be the same year that a firearms firm started by a fellow named Treshner would open its doors. Now, 21 years later, in 1859, Wilhelm would go to work for Treshner. By the 1890s, Wilhelm would be a member of the, by the way, all this is in Germany, if I didn't say that before. He would be a member of the Guild of Gunsmiths in Germany, as well as a part owner of Treshner's company. And now the guns and everything associated with it would be marked Tresco afterwards. Now, Wilhelm would die in 1906. The company would live on and would actually close its doors in 1940. That is a very broad background on our kind of company and where it is that this conversation originates and all that kind of stuff. Now, keep in mind, guys, we're talking the mid 1800s when like the story kind of gets rolling, like he's now a part of Tresco and all those types of things. Big time custom gun making. Custom in all regards, like like these guilds, these firms building literally every component, including the ammunition and chamberings, developing chamberings for their guns specifically, because when someone comes and buys a custom firearm from somebody, at this time, they would be offered the custom ammunition that goes along with it. We talked about that a little bit in the obscure and obsolete niche shotgun shell series as well. So sometimes these are like really big departures. Sometimes it was just like little things that just only worked with that particular manufacturer's chambering. And then just like any saleswoman today, sold somebody on the benefits of why their chambering was better than other stuff. Let's talk about the products that Tresco put together. These would be drillings. Now, for those of you who don't know, drillings are I believe, primarily German firearm, but something that you find in Europe. That is a combination arm, is what we refer to it as in the United States. So there's not a lot in the United States that accurately captures the combinations that you'll find with a drilling. So generally, it'll be some sort of rifle-shotgun combination. So it could be something so simple as what is referred to as a Doppelbüchseflinte, which would be a side-by-side or a double-barrel rifle with a single barrel shotgun, and then the inverse of that being a Doppelbüchsflinte. Not the best at German, so I'm reaching back to my German hunting class. Two shotgun barrels in whatever arrangement with a rifle barrel added along. You could even get these all the way up to where you would have mixed calibers, so you could have like a like 2 large caliber rifle barrels, 1 smaller than 6mm rifle barrel, and then like a shotgun barrel. The whole idea here was that the German hunter could go afield and he can hunt several different types of game. So if he's sitting there, he's on a drive hunt or something along those lines, and a pig comes by, he can nail it with his rifle. If, say, a fox runs by, he could shoot that with the smaller than 6mm cartridge. And then if a bird flushes, he can take it with a shotgun. Now, the biggest issue with any drilling is that you have a very complicated system of being able to select barrels, and you have to make sure that you have the proper barrel selected for whatever it is about to shoot at. So it wouldn't be very fun if you had a pig run by and you shot at it with like 16 gauge bird shot, when your original intention was to shoot it with, I don't know, your 7mm barrel or whatever. All right, so the drillings that Tresco were putting together were a 2-barrel affair with a large caliber rifle barrel and then a shotgun barrel right next to it. And what's really interesting is the operating mechanism. So there would be an underlever that you would turn sideways, which would bring the action forward and then hinge it slightly down. And the extractors were located, as I understand it, with the receiver that was being left behind. So it's not like they were just poking out of the barrels or anything along those lines. I find that a very interesting design. In addition to that, you had a safety in which when it was on, it obscured your sights, and then when it was off, it did not. Novel idea. Also something that we see with like Mausers from the time period. Now, drillings require, or in addition to the fact that like you have all these selectors and all this kind of stuff, drillings are not utilitarian firearms by any means. They have game scenes on them and stuff like that. Great scroll work, fancy stocks, lustrous finish, all those types of things. So this is definitely custom manufacturing at its finest. All right, so that is what they were producing. It's unclear to me if Collath came up with this action design or if this was something that Treshner was already doing. I suspect that Treshner was already doing it, but I have to point out at this juncture that information on these guns is actually kind of scant. Like a lot of the stuff that I have right now, I managed to have to go through like a whole bunch of forums and stuff like that for people who are coming across these firearms. And there's a lot of discussion as to whether or not these still constitute as firearms given their age and chamberings, which are not necessarily available in munitions. So there's a fella in Great Britain who initially had it added to his firearms card, because in a lot of European countries you have to have like a little card that has like all the firearms and their serial numbers and stuff like that you legally own. And he had it initially added to his up until the police, he asked the police to look into it, and they informed him that it was not, in fact, considered a firearm. We'll get into that, if I remember, more here in a little bit, but keep that little nugget in mind. So with that, why don't we go ahead and start talking about the ammunition. I want to start off with the rifle ammunition. It appears that Tresco was putting together its own cartridges somewhat. And this is why a lot of guys in these forums were saying that you need to make sure to get like a chamber cast or something along those lines in order to be able to determine the actual chambering of your firearm. Because it might say, for example, the example that was given was 8x42 rimmed, which rimmed cartridges would be very common at this time period because we're talking about a single shot gun. And it would be, and also rimless cartridges, because there wasn't a whole lot that could really work with rimless cartridges at this time. Okay, well, the 8x42 is a common enough cartridge, so it shouldn't be any big deal, correct? Well, somebody took a chamber cast of their chamber and discovered that the Tresco offering had a slight neck to it, which would not be common, as I understand it, to the 8x42. Don't know a lot about the 8x42. Not really interested in the 8x42 in this case, other than to identify that they were very clearly doing custom ammunition on the rifle side, in addition to the shotgun stuff we're going to talk about here in just a second. Again, now you have to come back to them for the ammunition at that point. Not a surprise from a custom maker from the time period. Okay. What's up with these shotguns, though, Murph? What's up with these shotgun shells? That's what we're here for. Well, keep in mind that our story runs through a time period in which self-contained cartridges are still being developed. And I actually did a whole video on the development of the self-contained cartridge, linked in the description. But Tresco would wind up going an interesting direction with their ammunition. Now, in the development of self-contained cartridges, we come across pin fire, which is where you have the firing pin extending from the cartridge casing itself, from the case lip specifically. in which it is acted upon by a hammer, which then causes the firing pin to impinge the primer and send the round downrange. Tresco would take a different approach with it. What I find very interesting is that Treshner and Wilhelm would work with a fellow named Drei, who would develop a needle gun. And what they did was they came up with the horizontal pin fire. Murph, what is that? Well, in this case, the firing pin, this simple nail, more or less, goes to the center of the cartridge base. Not different than a center fire pistol cartridge that would be developed here soon in this timeline of self-contained cartridges. It's still a pin fire, but now it's acted upon in a horizontal manner instead of coming down from the top, in order to be able to impinge the primer and send the round down range. So it feels like a further development of the drei concept. So what's unclear to me, and what I would assume is necessary for this to work, is that the firing pin of the drilling acts upon that firing pin in the base of the cartridge and sends the round down range. Now, these cartridges would be made from paper, either thick paper or thin paper. One of the things that I found interesting was that nobody acknowledged whether or not that was wax paper, which generally, whenever it is that you talk about like older shotgun shells or shotgun shells from a particular time period, people will specify that this is a wax paper cartridge casing. So I wonder about the durability of these particular cartridges. Something that I saw for the very first time is that there were some instances in which the ends of the cartridge casing were not crimped as we would traditionally see, but they were actually tied off, which is a manner of being able to contain like the shot and powder and all those types of things. I just never considered that that would be the go-to or default answer. And those pretty much had to have been like the thin paper cartridge casings at that point. Because I can't imagine you being able to like compress and tie off thick hulled paper cartridge casings in such a manner that would actually effectively seal them. Now there's some discussion about the colors of the cartridge casings. And I don't want to get too far into the colors portion of this because I found the person who discussed it to be a little bit confusing. He mentioned that there was one color for black powder and one color for smokeless powder, and then a third color of cartridge casing, but no powder associated with it. So I would be very careful trying to take that for at its face value at the very least. So these cartridges made it from black powder into smokeless powder, and it's important to keep in mind that if you have a gun, a Tresco drilling, that is chambered for the shotgun shell and is a black powder gun, it's not going to really be able to work with the smokeless powder because smokeless powder comes at a completely different pressure. Sounds like another storm's rolling in. All right, so we've covered the method of ignition. We've covered the cartridge casing. The next most interesting thing is that Collath would utilize a completely different gauge system. He would not go the same route as everybody else with like, oh, this is a 16 gauge because we went about the manner that we derive gauge in a shotgun shell, which if you want that, go ahead and go to the video covering that. Instead, he would have a numbering system from 0 to like 8, something like that, skipping over 2. I guess we don't like 2 for some reason, which is supposed to have an association with a recognized gauge. However, there's a couple of issues with that. One, shell length is not necessarily adequately covered in that, and I don't see anything that really gives an association for how long those shells were. So, oh, well, a 0 gauge is going to be, a 1 9/16 inch cartridge case or whatever it is that it may be. Regardless, it doesn't really matter in this case. As well as it's not, a lot of these gauges that they came up with are not one for 12 gauge or 16 gauge. They better correlate to something a little bit more in between. So this has caused people who have picked up these guns in places wherever it is that they're available. It doesn't seem like very many of these are available in the United States. I had a couple people in forums from like South America that were talking about them. They develop an insert that allows them to use a more modern shell. Now, of course, you have to be careful with that because if you're dealing with a black powder gun and you're loading up modern smokeless powder shells, that's definitely a recipe for disaster. And also, you're going to need to go ahead and get some chamber measurements and stuff like that so you can determine what length of cartridge you have to use. At this point, I would agree with the assessment that they had in Great Britain, that the firearm is obsolete, that it is an antique and not constituting an operational firearm in this case, because there's a whole lot of what ifs and maybes that you have to go through in order to be able to get one of these operational, and I don't think you get that effective of use out of one to begin with for those purposes. Like, you're not going to get as good of a gas seal, you're not going to get the best velocities, it's going to have a definite impact on like your patterning and all those types of things, and I would not consider it to be worthwhile to really pursue the shotgun side of this discussion. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting. That's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.